All right, so moving on to the last part where we're going to talk about the angiosperms. Now, this is probably the one you're most familiar with, and you'll probably find the most examples, and I think it is the one you have to find the most examples on your scavenger hunt. Now, this is a very diverse phylum. Phytoanthrophyta are the flowering plants. Now, these are the ones that evolved the latest, but became the most diverse plant group. There's about 300,000 species just within this group. Now, you probably heard of things called like monocots and dicots. Well, that's what this group is. Now, there's so much variety in this group, from the huge trees to the tiny duckweed to very tiny seeds to the largest seeds like coconuts. So much diversity in just one group. Now, most of these are going to be photosynthetic autotrophs, but they do have some parasites that fall into this category. Now, the reason this group has so much success is due to flowers and fruit, as they have really excelled at that and used that to their advantage. Now, we're going to break it up into some smaller groups. There's the Basil Angiosperms, which happen to be the water lilies, magnolia trees, and the laurels. And then you have the monocots and the dicots. Now, the monocots are going to be your lilies, grasses, your palms, and orchids, bananas up on there. And then the dicots is probably your most familiar flowering plants and a lot of your trees and your shrubs. So if you look at this little image right here, these are different key characteristics to tell if something is a monocot or a dicot. Looking at the netting of the leaves is one way, how the vascular tissue is organized, just the roots, and even looking at the number of petals on the flowers. So what is the point of flowers? Well, one of the key things that these plants got to do is go through the process of pollination. Now, pollination is to help us get gametes together in order to go through the process. So pollination is how plants have really modified a flower. So it basically is just modified leaves around a central stalk. And the colors and patterns offer specific signals, and they're kind of like flashing beacons to insects and stuff, like, hey, come here, look at this, come here, I have nectar, boom, boom, boom. So the nectar is like a reward. And we bring them here, and then as the bees get the nectar, then we're going to deposit the flower or pollen on them, and then they're going to keep going to another plant, and they'll deposit the pollen, and it's a sweet relationship for everyone. Now, there can be different types of scents between the flowers. There can be sweet, and then there's also the horrible ones. If you watch the plant video, there's like that one death-smelling plant. If you haven't, go back and watch it. It's in the plant overview slides. So let's talk about the anatomy of the flower a little bit. So when it comes to flowers, they can be one sex or both. And if it's both sexes, you're going to have both the male and the female parts. Now, the male parts are called the stamen. This is the male reproductive structure, and we break it up into two smaller parts. We have the anthers right here, which is where we're going to produce the pollen, and then the filament, boom, 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 is what's going to hold up the anther. So here's a long filament holding up an anther. Together, they make up the stamen. Now, the female part, which is that whole middle part right there, is the pistil. That's the whole term you can refer all of it together. They call it the carpels here. It's in, both of them are the same thing. You're going to have the ovaries where the ovules, so the female gametes, are produced. The stigma is where the pollen is going to land. A style is just a long tube connecting the stigma to the ovary. Now, other parts of the flower, you're going to have the petals, which I mentioned are used to attract pollinator, and then the sepals, which are going to be at the bottom, which help protect the flower. So here's the life cycle. Don't be too scared of it. I know it looks kind of scary, but it's really not too complicated. It does get a little juicy right here, but don't worry. I'm not going to ask specific questions off that. Now, the adult, or the sporophyte, is the main phase of the angiosperm's life cycle. As with gymnosperms, the previous lecture, angiosperms are heterospores, so you can have both the male and the female part. Now, they're going to generate what we call microspores, which are going to produce the pollen grains, which are the male gametophytes, and megaspores, which will form the ovule, which will be the female gametophytes. So that's a lot of word right there. So if you just kind of go within each part on its own and then follow them together, it makes a little bit more sense. So within the male, you're going to have the microsporangia, the male gametophytes. They're going to divide through the process of meiosis to give these haploid microspores. And then these haploid microspores are going to undergo mitosis and give rise to the individual pollen grains. Now what we need to do is have these pollen grains land on the style, go down the stigma, and all the whole process through the process of fertilization. So we talked about how we develop the pollen grains. Now let's talk about the female part, which they love to make it so difficult. I don't know why girls we do, but girl flowers, they just really love to make it really difficult. So within the ovule, within the ovary right here, you're going to have the megasporangiums protected by 2 layers. And within each of them, there's going to be a megasporocyte that undergoes meiosis. Boom, 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 boom. Now, the mature embryo sac has 1 egg cell, boom, boom, right there, 2 synergids, which are going to be called helper cells, boom, boom, I know, super complicated, and 3 antipodal cells, and 2 polar nuclei in the central cell. Seriously, girls, all this, like I said, extra stuff you don't need to know. Like I said, if we were majors, we would, but we're not majors, so don't worry about it. Now, what's going to happen is the pollen grain is going to reach the stigma. And then what's going to happen is a pollen tube is going to extend down the style and into the micropyle, an opening that goes into right here. So on the next slide, I'll have a little bit closer detail. And then what's going to happen is the sperm cell is going to be deposited in the embryo sac right here. And that's how we're going to get our future embryos. So let's look at it a little bit closer. So I said the sperm cell, that pollen tube comes through right here, the nuclei. It's going to be deposited right here, and they go through this process called double fertilization. Great video, helps with explaining everything too. Like I said, it's a lot more detailed than you need to know, but I just want to make sure I introduce it so when you see it in the book, you're not freaking out. Now what's going to happen, the egg and sperm are going to combine to form a diploid zygote, which is going to be the future embryo, all right, which is going to be right there. So here's your embryo right here. Now the process of double fertilization right here, we're going to still have another sperm nuclei that's going to go to the diploid cell, the center of the embryo cell. It's going to form this 3-in embryo. That's actually become the endosperm, which is going to be like a food source for the growing embryo. So it's not an embryo, but it's like a food source reserved for them. We actually use a lot of this for food baking and stuff. Now the ovary wall that was there before is going to thicken and form the fruit, and fruit is fertilized and fully grown ripened ovaries. So one thing you might ask is it a fruit or a vegetable? Well, one key thing though is fruits are going to contain seeds. So, and one misconception is not just sweet tasting foods. So your eggplant, zucchini, string beans, tomatoes, and bell peppers are actually fruits. Now they can be fleshy or dry. I have some examples of both of them right there. But the goal of fruits is to get your seeds dispersed in another place. So if you have the fleshy fruit that tastes really well, it's a good food source. The animal's going to consume the seed, and the seed will probably go through and it'll be deposited in the feces in a different location. Boom, you just moved around. Now, vegetables don't have root stems or leaves, and they're going to be more savory. Think about these right there. So your beets, your potatoes, spinach, kale, lettuce, celery, broccoli fall into that category. So let's talk a little bit about diversity. So the Basil angiosperms, I said, they really don't go into much detail about them, but this is believed to be like a smaller subgroup. They branched off before the monocots and dicots really separated, and they do have traits similar to both groups. So they really couldn't fall on either or, so they went and formed their own group. And you're going to find the magnolias, the water lilies, the pepper family fall into this group right here. Now the monocots, these are just some key things for those. If you go back to that slide earlier on where I had like the cartoon image showing key things, but they're going to have a single cotyledon in the seedling, and the veins are going to run parallel along the length of the leaf. Their flower parts are arranged in 3 to 6-fold symmetry, and you're not going to find true woody tissue, rarely found in this group. You might find some examples, but not that often. The vascular tissue is often scattered, and you're going to have multiple fibrous roots, so no major taproot. So you'll find a lot of the grasses, palms fall into this group. And a lot of crops that we use for food, for agriculture, fall in this group too. And then finally, the dicots, your pretty flowers, your ornamental stuff. You're going to have, if you look at the network on the leaves, you see the veins, they form like a nice dense network. They're not that parallel. You're going to see the true taproot. They can be herbaceous or produce woody tissue. So you'll find a lot of diversity with this one. 2/3 of all flowering plants fall in this group. And here's just a few examples. So think about the spring and all the wildflowers coming up. You're probably looking at a bunch of dicots. So that's going to wrap up plants. Here's some review videos. And then, of course, credit for my images.